It was one of those evenings where everything seemed calm and peaceful. The sky had turned a deep shade of orange as the sun slowly sank behind the horizon, painting the world in warm hues. Cars moved steadily along the highway, their headlights flickering on as twilight approached. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a man who had spent most of his life serving his country with pride. He wasn't just any ordinary citizen. He was a decorated military officer who had risen through the ranks to become a lieutenant colonel. His work often took him to high-stakes meetings at the Pentagon, advising top officials on matters of national security. But tonight, Marcus wasn't thinking about strategy or global threats. He was simply driving home after spending time with his family, a rare moment of normalcy in an otherwise demanding life. Marcus's car, a sleek black sedan, hummed softly as it cruised down the road. It wasn't flashy or overly expensive, but it was well maintained, a reflection of Marcus's disciplined personality. As he drove, his mind wandered to thoughts of dinner plans and catching up on some much-needed rest. Little did he know, this quiet evening would soon take a dramatic turn that would leave him shaken and change how others saw him forever. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered. Bright red and blue lights flashed in Marcus's rearview mirror, startling him out of his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly composed himself. Pulling over was second nature to him. He'd been stopped countless times before, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of the color of his skin. Every black driver knew the drill. Keep your hands visible, stay calm, and hope for the best. Marcus signaled and eased his car onto the shoulder of the road, making sure to follow all the rules he'd learned growing up in a world that didn't always treat people like him fairly. As he brought the vehicle to a stop, Marcus glanced in the mirror again. A police cruiser was parked closely behind him, its lights still flashing ominously. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked toward Marcus's car. Something about the way he moved made Marcus uneasy. There was no casualness. In his stride, it was deliberate, almost aggressive. Marcus could feel the tension building even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He reminded himself to stay calm. After all, he was a respected member of the military, someone who had dedicated years of his life to protecting the very system this officer represented. Surely, reason would prevail here. The officer tapped sharply on Marcus's window, startling him slightly. "License and registration," came the sharp command, delivered in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Marcus nodded silently, rolling down the window just enough to speak clearly while keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might be misinterpreted. When he handed over his license and registration, the officer barely glanced at them. Instead, his eyes scanned the interior of the car, lingering suspiciously on the dashboard, the seats, and even the back seat. "You're driving a nice car," the officer remarked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How'd you afford this? You running drugs, selling stolen goods?" Each word hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned how a black man could own something valuable without assuming criminal activity. But hearing it now in this situation felt especially infuriating. "I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army," Marcus replied evenly, meeting the officer's gaze with unwavering confidence. "My identification is right there." He gestured subtly toward the documents in the officer's hand. For a brief moment there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars. Marcus hoped that revealing his rank and profession would put an end to this unnecessary ordeal. Instead, the officer's demeanor shifted from suspicion to outright hostility. Before Marcus could react, the officer placed his hand on the grip of his holstered gun, his posture rigid and confrontational. "Step out of the car slowly," he barked, his voice louder and more menacing than before. Marcus froze, his mind racing. Was this really happening? Here he was, a highly trained military officer who had faced danger in combat zones around the world, now being treated like a common criminal on a deserted stretch of highway. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to dwell on it. Survival instincts kicked in and Marcus raised his hands slightly, palms open, signaling compliance. He couldn't help but notice the absurdity of the situation. Just hours earlier, he had been sitting at the dining table with his parents, laughing and sharing stories about his latest mission briefing. Now, he was staring down the barrel of potential violence, all because of assumptions rooted in prejudice. The weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest, but Marcus refused to let fear consume him. If anything, he felt a surge of determination. This encounter wouldn't define him. It would fuel him. And as he prepared to respond to the officers' demands, Marcus knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every individual who had been reduced to a stereotype rather than seen for who they truly were. But for now, Marcus focused on staying alive. Whatever happened next, he vowed to handle it with dignity, even if the same couldn't be said for the man standing outside his car, gripping his weapon like it was the only thing keeping him safe. The air inside Marcus's car felt heavy, almost suffocating, as the officer's sharp commands echoed through the open window. Marcus's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from gripping it tightly. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze boring into him, scrutinizing every detail about him. The way he sat, the clothes he wore, even the expression on his face. It was as if the officer was looking not at a human being, but at some kind of suspect who needed to be interrogated and intimidated. "You're driving a nice car," the officer repeated, his tone laced with suspicion. "How'd you afford this? You running drugs, selling stolen goods?" Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, chipping away at Marcus's patience. He had heard these kinds of questions before, but they always stung just the same. They weren't really questions. They were accusations disguised as curiosity, designed to provoke a reaction or justify further aggression. Marcus bit down hard, on his tongue to stop himself from snapping back. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Staying calm was his only option. "I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army," Marcus said again, his voice firm but controlled. "My identification is right there." He nodded toward the document still clutched in the officer's hand. For a moment, there was silence. The officer glanced down at the license and registration, then back up at Marcus. His eyes narrowed, as though he didn't believe what he was seeing, or perhaps didn't want to. Instead of acknowledging the information, he continued circling around the car, peering into the windows and shining his flashlight into every corner. Marcus watched him in the side mirror, trying to keep track of where the officer was without making any sudden movements. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. The officer's behavior grew more aggressive, his steps heavier, his tone sharper. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, pointing his flashlight directly at Marcus's face. The beam blinded him momentarily, forcing him to squint against the harsh light. This isn't right, Marcus thought to himself. This isn't how it's supposed to go. He had done everything by the book, signaled properly, pulled over safely, handed over his documents without hesitation. Yet here he was, being treated like someone who had committed a crime. The injustice of it burned inside him, but he pushed the anger deep down. He couldn't afford to let it show, not when the situation was already so volatile. Then came the moment Marcus had been dreading, the sound of leather creaking as the officer reached for his holster. Marcus's heart sank as he saw the glint of metal, a gun now drawn and pointed directly at him. "Step out of the car slowly," the officer shouted, his voice rising with each word. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to protest, to demand answers, but he knew better than to argue with a weapon aimed at his head. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and raised both hands above the steering wheel, palms facing outward. "I'm getting out," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "There's no need for this." But the officer wasn't listening. His finger hovered near the trigger, his stance rigid and unyielding. To him, Marcus wasn't a decorated military officer or a respected member of society. He was just another black man in a car too nice for comfort, someone who fit a vague profile of suspicion. And in that moment, none of Marcus's accomplishments mattered. None of his years of service, None of his sacrifices for his country. It all disappeared under the shadow of prejudice. As Marcus stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, he couldn't shake the feeling of surrealism. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like him. He had faced danger before, yes, but always in situations where the stakes were clear. On battlefields, during missions, in places where conflict was expected. Here, on a quiet stretch of highway in suburban America, the danger felt different. It was personal. It was rooted in fear and ignorance, not strategy or warfare. And yet, the threat was just as real. The officer kept his distance, his gun still trained on Marcus. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood of the car," he ordered. Marcus obeyed, leaning forward until his palms touched the cool surface of the sedan. He could hear the crunch of gravel beneath the officer's boots as he approached, could feel the tension radiating off him. The officer patted him down roughly, searching for weapons or contraband that didn't exist. When nothing turned up, the officer stepped back, but his demeanor hadn't softened. "Explain yourself," the officer demanded, his voice dripping with hostility. "What are you doing out here? Where are you coming from?" Marcus took a deep breath, willing himself to stay composed. "I told you, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. I'm on leave visiting my family. I was heading home when you pulled me over." He spoke slowly, enunciating each word clearly, hoping to break through the wall of suspicion surrounding him. The officer scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "Yeah, sure. And I'm supposed to believe that? You expect me to take your word for it?" Marcus clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew arguing would only make things worse, but the absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. How many times did he have to repeat himself? How much proof did this man need? Still, Marcus reminded himself of something important. He wasn't just fighting for himself. If he lost control now, if he gave in to anger, it wouldn't just reflect poorly on him. It would reinforce the very stereotypes the officer was clinging to. That thought alone kept him grounded. "I don't expect you to take my word for it," Marcus replied evenly. "But I do expect you to verify it. Let me make a phone call. One call will confirm everything I've said." He paused, waiting for the officer's response. Would he allow it, or would he double down on his aggression? For a long moment, the officer hesitated. His grip on the gun tightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus's face. There was a flicker of doubt in his expression, though whether it stemmed from uncertainty or reluctance to admit he might be wrong, Marcus couldn't tell. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer lowered his weapon slightly. Not entirely, but enough to signal that he was considering the request. "Fine," he muttered grudgingly. "Make your call, but don't try anything funny." Relief washed over Marcus, though he didn't let it show. He reached carefully into his pocket for his phone, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As he dialed the number, he couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a high-ranking military official whose work had taken him to the highest levels of government, having to prove his identity to a police officer who refused to believe him based solely on the color of his skin. It was infuriating. Yes, but it also underscored the deeper issues at play. This wasn't just about one man's bias. It was about a system that allowed such biases to thrive unchecked. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered on the other, and "General Anders speaking." Marcus exhaled sharply, his voice steady as he began explaining the situation. Beside him, the officer listened intently, his scowl deepening with every passing second. Whatever doubts he'd harbored earlier were quickly melting away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. By the time Marcus finished the call, the power dynamic between them had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something far more complex, and far more revealing about the state of justice in America. Marcus held the phone tightly to his ear, his mind racing as he waited for General Anders to pick up. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching longer than the last. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the gun still pointed in his direction, the skeptical glare of the officer watching his every move. But Marcus knew that this call could be the turning point. If anyone could cut through the tension and confusion, it was General Anders, a man who had worked closely with Marcus on numerous high-stakes projects at the Pentagon. When the general finally answered, his voice was sharp and authoritative, the kind that commanded respect without needing to raise its tone. "General Anders speaking," he said briskly, clearly expecting an urgent matter. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sir, this is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson," he began, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I'm currently pulled over by a police officer who seems unwilling to accept my credentials. He's drawn his weapon and is refusing to believe I am who I say I am." Marcus paused, glancing briefly at the officer standing a few feet away. The man's face was unreadable, though there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes as he realized Marcus wasn't bluffing about making a powerful connection. On the other end of the line, General Anders immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His tone softened slightly, but his words carried the same authority they always did. "Marcus, are you safe? What exactly is happening?" "I'm fine, sir, but the situation is escalating unnecessarily," Marcus replied. "I've shown my ID and explained my rank, but the officer isn't listening. I thought calling you might help clarify things." General Anders wasted no time. "Give me the details. Location, badge number if you can see it, and I'll handle this personally." There was a steely determination in his voice, the kind that came from years of leadership and experience. Marcus quickly relayed the information, including the highway exit number and the officer's patrol car ID visible on the side panel. As Marcus spoke, the officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado beginning to crack. It was clear he hadn't expected this routine traffic stop to spiral into something involving the Pentagon. For the first time since pulling Marcus over, the officer lowered his weapon slightly, though his grip remained tight. He leaned closer, trying to catch snippets of the conversation, his expression a mix of suspicion and growing unease. Once Marcus finished giving the details, General Anders assured him that action would be taken immediately. "Stay calm, Marcus. I'll contact local authorities right away. This won't go unresolved." With that, the call ended, leaving Marcus standing beside his car, phone still in hand, while the officer stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars and the faint rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. Now, it was up to others to take responsibility for de-escalating the situation. Still, he kept his guard up, knowing that the officer's reaction was unpredictable. Finally, the officer broke the silence. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less aggressive but still laced with skepticism. "That was General Anders," Marcus replied evenly, meeting the officer's gaze head-on. "He's one of the senior advisors at the Pentagon. You can verify my identity if you'd like. I'm sure your superiors will confirm everything I've told you." The officer hesitated, his fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. He glanced at the documents in his hand again, then back at Marcus. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. Could this man really be who he claimed to be? Was it possible that he had made a mistake? Before the officer could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Both men turned their heads toward the source, watching as multiple police vehicles approached the scene, their lights flashing brightly against the darkening sky. Within moments, they surrounded the area, blocking off the highway shoulder. Officers poured out of the cars, some in uniform and others in plain clothes, their badges gleaming under the artificial glow of headlights. One of them stepped forward, a commanding figure with the unmistakable presence of someone used to taking charge. "Officer Dalton," he called out, addressing the man who had drawn his weapon on Marcus. "We need to speak with you immediately." Dalton's face paled as he recognized the insignia on the newcomer's jacket. These weren't ordinary patrol officers. They were internal affairs investigators sent to assess the situation directly. Word traveled fast when the Pentagon got involved. and it was clear that this incident had already reached higher levels of authority. As the investigators questioned Dalton, Marcus stood quietly by his car, observing the unfolding drama. He didn't gloat or express anger. Instead, he maintained the same composed demeanor he'd shown throughout the ordeal. Inside, however, his emotions churned. Relief, frustration, and sadness battled for dominance. Part of him wished this hadn't happened at all, that he could have driven home without incident. Another part of him knew that moments like this were inevitable, not just for him, but for countless others who faced similar treatment daily. Meanwhile, Dalton struggled to explain himself. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by nervous stammering as he tried to justify his actions. I was following protocol, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. He fit the description of someone we've been looking for. What description? One of the investigators shot back sharply. Be specific. Dalton faltered, unable to provide a coherent answer. It was painfully obvious that his decision to pull Marcus over and escalate the situation so drastically had been based on nothing more than racial profiling. And now, with cameras rolling and reporters arriving on the scene, the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Back at his car, Marcus watched silently as the investigators continued questioning Dalton. Reporters had gathered behind the barrier tape, snapping photos and recording video. News vans with towering antennas lined the roadside, broadcasting live updates to viewers across the country. The story was spreading rapidly, fueled by eyewitness accounts and social media posts from drivers who had witnessed parts of the confrontation. Despite the chaos, Marcus remained focused. He knew that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about shining a light on systemic issues that affected millions of people. As much as he wanted to walk away and forget the whole ordeal, he also understood the importance of using his platform to advocate for change. If sharing his story could prevent even one person from experiencing a similar injustice, it would be worth it. Eventually, one of the investigators approached Marcus, extending a hand in apology. Colonel Thompson, I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through tonight. We're handling this internally, and rest assured appropriate measures will be taken. Marcus nodded, accepting the gesture without hesitation. Thank you, he said simply. But let's not lose sight of why this happened in the first place. This isn't just about me. It's about fixing the biases that lead to situations like this. The investigator agreed, promising to prioritize reforms within the department. As the crowd of officers dispersed and the scene began to calm, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He climbed back into his car, closing the door softly behind him. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins during the standoff was fading, replaced by exhaustion, but also by resolve. This wasn't the end of the road for Marcus. In fact, it was just the beginning. As the investigators continued their questioning of Officer Dalton, Marcus sat quietly in his car, taking a moment to process everything that had just happened. The adrenaline rush was starting to wear off, leaving him drained, but also more determined than ever. He glanced at the chaos outside. Police vehicles with flashing lights, reporters setting up cameras, and curious onlookers gathered behind barriers. What had started as a simple drive home had turned into a national spectacle, and Marcus knew this wasn't something he could simply walk away from. The investigators were thorough, asking Dalton pointed questions about his actions during the traffic stop. Why did you escalate to drawing your weapon? One of them demanded. Did you verify his credentials before making accusations? Another added, what specific evidence led you to believe Lieutenant Colonel Thompson posed a threat? Dalton stumbled over his answers, his earlier bravado replaced by nervous stammering. I thought he might be involved in something illegal, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. When pressed for details, he admitted there was no concrete reason, just a vague suspicion based on Marcus's appearance and the type of car he drove. It was clear to everyone present that this admission painted Dalton in an unfavorable light. Racial profiling wasn't just implied, it was glaringly obvious. Meanwhile, Marcus remained calm, watching the scene unfold with a mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. Finally, someone was holding Dalton accountable for his actions. But another part of him felt sadness. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. A man who swore to protect and serve had let bias cloud his judgment, putting an innocent person's life at risk. And while Marcus understood that not all officers acted this way, incidents like this eroded public trust in law enforcement as a whole. Reporters began shouting questions as they spotted Marcus sitting in his car. "Colonel Thompson, can we get a statement?" one called out. "How does it feel to have been treated this way?" asked another. The floodlights from news vans illuminated the area, turning the quiet highway into a stage for a much larger conversation about race, power, and accountability. Marcus stepped out of his car knowing he couldn't ignore the media entirely. If he wanted to make a difference, this was his chance to speak directly to the public. He adjusted his jacket, took a deep breath, and walked toward the reporters, flanked by 2 internal affairs officers who ensured his safety. Cameras clicked furiously as he approached, capturing every movement. Microphones were thrust forward, eager to catch his words. "Thank you for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured. "Tonight I experienced something that far too many people in this country face daily: discrimination based solely on the color of my skin." His tone was neither angry nor accusatory. Instead, it carried a weight of authority and sincerity. "I'm a decorated military officer who has served this nation proudly for years. Yet tonight I was pulled over, questioned aggressively, and held at gunpoint, all because of assumptions rooted in prejudice." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Marcus paused briefly, letting the gravity of his statement sink in. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about the countless individuals who don't have the resources or connections to call someone in the Pentagon when they're wrongfully targeted. It's about the parents who fear for their children's lives every time they leave the house. It's about the communities that are tired of seeing justice delayed or denied altogether." His words resonated deeply, both with those standing nearby and with viewers watching live broadcasts at home. Social media erupted almost instantly, with hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racial Profiling" trending nationwide. People shared stories of similar experiences, amplifying the message Marcus was trying to convey. Systemic racism wasn't an isolated issue. It was pervasive and needed to be addressed head-on. Back at the scene, Officer Dalton's fate became increasingly clear. The investigators concluded their initial assessment and escorted him away from the group, his shoulders slumped in defeat. While formal charges would take time to process, it was evident that Dalton's career in law enforcement was over. Internal affairs representatives assured Marcus that disciplinary action would follow swiftly, including termination and potential criminal charges depending on the outcome of their investigation. As the night wore on, local authorities arrived to manage the growing crowd and ensure order. They thanked Marcus for his cooperation and reiterated their commitment to reform within the department. One senior officer even offered a personal apology, acknowledging the harm caused by incidents like this. "We owe it to our community to do better," he said earnestly, "and we will." Despite the apologies and promises, Marcus knew real change wouldn't come overnight. Words were important, but actions mattered more. As he prepared to leave the scene, he made a mental note to stay involved in advocacy efforts moving forward. He had a unique platform, and he intended to use it wisely. Before driving away, Marcus took one last look at the chaotic scene. The reporters packing up their equipment, the police vehicles pulling away, and the remnants of yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. It was surreal to think how quickly his evening had spiraled into something so monumental. But as he slid behind the wheel of his car and turned the key in the ignition, he reminded himself of why this moment mattered. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for every person who had been reduced to a stereotype rather than seen for who they truly were. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change might not happen immediately, but stories like his could spark conversations, inspire action, and remind the world that courage, resilience, and truth could shine even in the darkest moments. With a final glance in the rearview mirror, Marcus pulled back onto the highway, heading home under the cover of stars. The night may have been long, but the journey toward justice was only beginning. In the days following the incident, Marcus Thompson's story dominated headlines across the country. News outlets couldn't get enough of the dramatic confrontation. A decorated military officer held at gunpoint by a police officer whose actions were rooted in racial bias. Social media buzzed with reactions, opinions, and personal stories from people who had faced similar injustices. The hashtag Justice for Marcus trended for days, accompanied by heartfelt messages of support and calls for systemic reform. For Marcus, it was both overwhelming and humbling to see his experience resonate so deeply with so many. But Marcus wasn't one to bask in attention or seek sympathy. Instead, he channeled the spotlight into action. He began speaking out publicly, using interviews, op-eds, and community forums to address the larger issues that his encounter highlighted. "This isn't about revenge," he said during an interview on national television. "It's about accountability and education. We need to change the way we think, the way we train our officers, and the way we treat each other as human beings." His words struck a chord, not only with those who had experienced discrimination firsthand, but also with allies eager to help create meaningful change. Schools invited him to speak to students about leadership and resilience. Advocacy groups asked him to lend his voice to campaigns aimed at ending racial profiling and promoting equity within law enforcement. Even lawmakers reached out, seeking his input on proposed legislation designed to increase transparency and accountability in policing. Meanwhile, the fallout for Officer Rick Dalton continued to unfold. After an internal investigation confirmed that his actions were unjustified and based on racial bias, Dalton was fired from the force. His attempts to defend himself fell flat when confronted with evidence of his behavior during the traffic stop. "I was just doing my job," he claimed in a brief statement to reporters, but the public wasn't buying it. Videos of the incident, captured by bystanders and news cameras, painted a damning picture of a man acting out of prejudice rather than professionalism. Legal consequences soon followed. Prosecutors charged Dalton with misconduct and violation of civil rights, citing the unjustified escalation and use of force against Marcus. While some argued that these charges didn't go far enough, others saw them as a step toward holding individuals accountable for perpetuating systemic racism. Regardless of the outcome, the case served as a powerful reminder that no one, not even law enforcement, was above scrutiny. Back in his hometown, Marcus tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He spent time with his family, finding comfort in their love and support. Yet even in quiet moments, his mind often wandered back to the events of that night. How close had he come to tragedy? What if he hadn't been able to make that call to General Anders? These questions lingered, underscoring the fragility of his situation and the reality that not everyone had the resources or connections to escape such encounters unharmed. Determined to turn his reflections into action, Marcus became more involved in advocacy work. He partnered with organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform, helping develop training programs for police departments focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. He also worked closely with grassroots movements, amplifying the voices of marginalized communities fighting for equality and fairness. One of his most impactful initiatives was organizing town hall meetings where residents could share their experiences with law enforcement. These gatherings provided a safe space for dialogue, allowing both citizens and officers to express their concerns and frustrations. At one particularly memorable meeting, a young woman tearfully recounted how she had been stopped multiple times while driving her father's car, always under the assumption that she must have stolen it. Her story resonated deeply with Marcus, reminding him why this work mattered so much. As weeks turned into months, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in public discourse. More people were talking openly about race and privilege, challenging long-held assumptions and biases. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing oversight of police conduct, while schools incorporated lessons on diversity and inclusion into their curriculums. It wasn't perfect progress, but it was progress nonetheless. And Marcus took pride in knowing he had played a role in sparking these conversations. Still, he remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Change was slow and resistance was inevitable. Some critics dismissed his efforts as unnecessary or overly political, arguing that incidents like his were isolated occurrences rather than symptoms of a broader problem. Others accused him of grandstanding, claiming he was exploiting the situation for personal gain. But Marcus brushed off the negativity, focusing instead on the positive impact he could make. At a press conference held several months after the incident, Marcus stood before a packed room of reporters, activists, and supporters. His demeanor was calm yet commanding, exuding the same confidence that had carried him through that harrowing night. "This isn't about me," he reiterated, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about every person who has ever been judged not by their character but by the color of their skin. It's about ensuring that future generations don't have to endure what so many of us have faced." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the auditorium. Cameras flashed as journalists jotted down notes, capturing every word Marcus spoke. Outside, hundreds of demonstrators gathered, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "End racial profiling now." Their presence underscored the growing momentum behind the movement Marcus had helped ignite. When the press conference ended, Marcus took a moment to reflect. Standing alone backstage, he thought about how far he'd come since that fateful evening on the highway. He had transformed a traumatic experience into an opportunity to drive change, proving that even in the face of adversity, hope and determination could prevail. And as he stepped outside to greet the cheering crowd, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, with the support of countless others committed to justice and equality, they would continue pushing forward, one step at a time. For Marcus, this wasn't the end of the journey. It was merely the beginning of a lifelong mission to create a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, could live without fear of judgment or harm. And though the fight was far from over, he believed wholeheartedly that change was possible, if only people refused to give up.